All right, so now with that we have a solid understanding of what aggregate demand is. Let's dive in a little deeper and see, well, what makes the aggregate demand curve and the aggregate supply curve shift? What factors can shift the AD and the AS curves? All right, so what does an aggregate demand curve look like? You got it. It's downward sloping, right? Goes down like that. We'll call it aggregate demand. On the left-hand side, we have the price level. On the right-hand side, we have the quantity of output. Anyway, so you know what? Whenever we're talking about price level changes, right? When the price level's here, we have this quantity of output. So whenever we're talking about a price level change, for example, the price goes up, that's basically called a movement, right? And you guys know this. I know you know this, but it's a movement along the curve, okay? So it's basically a change in the quantity demanded due to price level change, right? But whenever we want to talk about shifts, it has to be something that does not talk about price. Am I right? You guys know I am right. So for example, if I want to talk about a shift in the aggregate demand curve, it has to be a non-price level change that affects aggregate spending. That's what can shift the demand curve. So basically, if there's a shift to the right, if we go from AD1 to AD2, then we can see that more is demanded at each price level, right? A higher amount of quantity is demanded at each price level. And if it shifts to the left, less demand, there's less demand at each price level. So if we shift to the left, what do you think? Is that good for the economy or bad for the economy? You're right. That's bad for the economy. So why might the aggregate demand curve shift right? Okay, I've told you before, it's because of change of consumption, investment, government purchases, net exports, and the money supply. These are things that can shift the aggregate demand curve, right? So if we have increased consumer confidence, or perhaps we've reduced the consumption tax, the government has reduced the GST, for example, that would push the aggregate demand curve to the right, right? We would demand more in that case, wouldn't we? Right? We would demand more in that case. Changes of investment, for example, if businesses start investing more, right? That moves the aggregate demand curve to the right. If, for example, people start buying more houses, that's investment, right? So that shifts the aggregate demand curve to the right. Changes in government purchases. Often governments will, when the economy gets tough, what they'll do is they will spend more money. That's called fiscal stimulus, okay? It comes from the government, right? From Mr. Trudeau. He will spend more money. And in that case, that will stimulate the economy, and that will move the aggregate demand curve to the right. Also, net exports, right? Net exports is an important one. So when the value of the Canadian dollar goes down, what happens to net exports? It increases, right? Goods become less expensive for foreigners, right? So we produce a lot more and we sell to foreigners. Our quantity of output increases. And also, if our Canadian dollar goes down, that means foreign goods are more expensive. So Canadians will prefer Canadian goods. Anyways, the result of a lower Canadian dollar shifts out the aggregate demand curve, right? Just like on the graph. But the most interesting one here, and it just reminds us that, hey, we are in the short run here. Changes in the money supply. Yes, that's right. When the Bank of Canada increases the money supply, that shifts the aggregate demand curve to the right. Most of the time, this has to do with interest rates. When the Bank of Canada increases the money supply, there's more money there to borrow, right? So interest rates will come down, and that will mean We will consume more in a way, right? Because we will buy new cars at 0% interest. We will also buy houses as well, and businesses will also borrow money to invest as well. So changes in the money supply in the short run does impact the economy. It does impact the quantity of output in the short run. See, I told you guys. All right, guys, final test. It says identify the GDP components the example would affect. How would it impact aggregate demand? Okay, so what are the GDP components? Y equals C plus I plus G plus NX, right? So, and then which way would it shift AD? Is it going to shift AD to the right, or is it going to shift it to the left? Pause this video, please, and work out the answers by yourself. This is easy stuff. Pause. All right, guys, number one, a drop in the foreign exchange value of the dollar. The Canadian dollar goes down. Oh no, CAD goes down. And so what's going to happen? Which of these components, CIG or NX? That's going to be NX is the right answer. And basically it's going to shift the demand curve to the left or the right, guys. You guessed it, going to shift it to the right, right? Goods are going to become cheaper for foreigners, and foreign goods for Canadians is going to become more expensive. Number two, increased security about jobs and future income. Hey, the economy is ripping and roaring. This is known as consumer confidence, right? So, which one is it going to affect? CIG or NX? You got it. It's going to affect C, consumption, more consumer confidence. So consumer confidence is going to go up, and then AD is going to shift to the, you got it, to the right. And number three, improvements in economic conditions in other countries. You got it. It's going to affect NX, net exports, right? And so net exports will increase because more foreigners will be able to buy our goods. And what's going to happen to aggregate demand? Good job. It's going to be shifting to the right. Okay, number four, a reduction in real interest rates. Right? So nominal interest rates are corrected for inflation, but a reduction in real interest rates not due to price level changes, right? So we're talking about real interest rates here, the supply and demand of loanable funds. So there's a greater supply of loanable funds perhaps, right? And so what happens is there's a reduction of real interest rates. What's going to happen? Investment. Investment is going to go up, right? Businesses are going to buy, people are going to be buying houses. So, and investment goes up, aggregate demand curve is going to shift to the, you got it, to the right. All right, decreases in taxes. Everybody likes that. Tax decreases. What is that going to affect? All right, well, that's going to affect consumption, especially if that's sales tax, right? There's a decrease in the sales tax, definitely consumption. They're not very, so consumption is going to increase. They're not very specific here about what kind of tax decreases. What would happen if there was a decrease in the corporate tax rate? What would happen? That's right, investment should increase. Hopefully it's valuable increase. So it could affect C, it could affect I, but regardless, it's going in the same direction. How is that going to impact aggregate demand? It's going to shift to the, you're right, to the right. Number six, an increase in the amount of money in circulation. Woohoo! They're printing money. That's going to impact which variables? You got it. Consumption is going to go up, and also investment is going to go up as well. And that's going to shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. Wow, this stuff is easy. Practice makes perfect. What happens to the aggregate demand curve in each of the following scenarios? Please pause the video and work this out by yourself. How'd you guys do? All right, the aggregate supply curve basically tells us the total quantity of goods firms produce and sell, right? At any given price level. All right. And we briefly looked at this for a second. We've got our quantity of output, right? And we've got our price level, right? And our aggregate supply curve moves up like this. Now, I should say that unlike the aggregate demand curve is always sloping downwards, right? You guys know that. But the aggregate supply curve shows a relationship, right, between the price level and the quantity of output that depends on the time horizon being examined. Okay, and as we know, right? So we'll be studying that here in this section. What does the long run aggregate supply curve look like? And what does the short run aggregate supply curve look like? I'll give you a hint. It has to do with monetary neutrality. Increasing the money supply increases the price level, but that has no effect on real variables like the quantity of output. So therefore, while the short run aggregate supply curve looks as it does, as you can see right now, as the price level increases, what happens to real GDP? Real GDP, the quantity of output also increases. Wow! So when you print money and the price level goes up, in the short run, it increases real GDP. It increases the quantity of output. However, we know what the long run aggregate supply curve would look like. Straight up and down, folks. That's right. The long run aggregate supply curve basically says in the long run, after everything, all the prices have been adjusted, the general price level, the contractual wage rate, and all expectations out there in the economy, after all that's happened, this could take 5, 10 years, right? Whatever. And after then, any increase in the price level here will have no effect whatsoever on real GDP. And again, that's because of monetary neutrality. Is that spelt right? I highly doubt it. It might be. Anyways, that was just luck. So anyways, that's what the aggregate supply curves look like. So let's go on to the next slide. All right, guys. So why? Why is the aggregate supply curve? Why is that vertical in the long run? Well, in the long run, right, an economy's production of goods and services is real GDP depends on its supplies of labor, right? What do I mean by labor? Like the kind of labor, like the kind of education that they have. How many people do we have in the economy, right? This is all these things that we learned about in chapter 7 when we were talking about productivity, right? When we're talking about our long run aggregate supply curve, which is supposed to be completely vertical there, never mind my picture, when does this shift? When does this shift? Well, it shifts when we have increased or better labor, when people get educations, we have more physical capital, when we have better natural resources, when we develop new technology in order to create or manufacture all these goods. It's these things that can move the long run aggregate supply curve. And ultimately, it can increase a nation's ability to produce goods and services. So that's what we want. We want a long run aggregate supply curve to be shifting right, because that improves our country's ability to produce goods and services. And that is a great way to increase our real GDP in the long run, and therefore also our standard of living. All right, so that's what it looks like, right? So a change in the price level does not affect the quantity of goods and services supplied in the long run. And you can see when the economy is running at its full potential, that is called running at its natural level of output. Sometimes, and most often actually, in the news, it means that the economy is running at full employment. When the economy is running at full employment, it is said to be working at its natural level of output. All right. And so, anyways, if there's any fluctuations away from that, right, to the left, for example, right, then we know that the economy is not working at its full potential, and maybe we need to do something about it. Anyways, let's move on. All right, so this is what it looks like, the long run aggregate supply curve. Now, typically it shifts to the, which way would it typically shift? Shouldn't even be using the word typical. It is always shifted to the right. Hypothetically, I guess it could shift to the right, to the left, but that would mean that our potential has gotten worse, right? So in other words, our long run aggregate supply curve is our potential. It is when we are operating at our best, right? It is when we are working at full employment. Does that mean we're always working at full employment? No, we can move away from full employment, but that would just be a short run thing. Eventually the economy would correct itself and move towards long run equilibrium, and we'd be working at full employment again. As a matter of fact, we don't even have to wait for the economy to correct itself. Chapter 15 is all about saying, hey, it can take years and years and years for the economy to correct itself. We can step in and do something about it, right? We can take action. Anyways, but we have always seen a long run aggregate supply curve that has shifted to the right because we've always had a growing population. The amount of human capital and physical capital has always grown. We've always discovered more and more natural resources, and our advancements in technology. Well, look at that picture right there. That was 100 years ago. Look at farming 100 years ago today and how it has changed and has really brought that long run aggregate supply curve and shifted it to the right and to the right and to the right. Technological change here, I should put an asterisk to it because it's had the greatest influence on the long run aggregate supply curve throughout our history. Anyways, so the only way it would ever shift to the left is if, I don't know, we started decreasing in population, or maybe we stopped getting educated. We stopped researching and developing. Like, I can't imagine that happening. We stopped technological progress. I don't think that would happen. I suppose we could argue, or someone could argue, that we might deplete our natural resources, but even that is skeptical. Anyway, so why might the long run aggregate supply curve shift? Right? Because changes of labor, perhaps it's immigration, um, um, people getting educated, right? Changes in capital, increased human capital. We found new mineral deposits, for example. Um, and even if we have the ability to import resources at a cheaper price, right? So free trade and free trade agreements can make natural resources and other resources more available or more plentiful, right? Even in a technological knowledge, I mean, the inventor of the computer and Google, and now with artificial intelligence, we could see a great shift. I think, I mean, I don't know, I'm not a scientist, man, but I think AI is going to change the world. You never know. And will I? Yeah, I'll be alive to see it. I'm a young man. Anyways, take care.